Welcome to the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology podcast. I'm Gideon Barr, the Executive Director of the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology, and I'm joined today by Dr. Kenneth Kemp, who's written a very fine article for us on evolution and the Catholic response to the theory of biological evolution. So, Dr. Kemp, thank you very much for coming to Cape Girardeau and sitting down with me.
Thanks for the invitation.
It's been a joy to have you and to interact with your article. It's probably of all the topics of articles that have come in, yours is probably the topic that's maybe the most controversial or gets a lot of airtime, even outside of kind of explicitly theological circles. And so I think what you've turned in is a very fine article, and it really only scratches the surface of a very rich history and very interesting philosophical and theological questions. So I know you've written more on that, and we'll probably talk about that. But thank you anyway for your contribution.
Oh, well, it was, thanks for the invitation. I've been working on the topic for a long time, so it's always nice to hear that somebody's interested, somebody besides me.
Of course. So what we want to do today really is mostly to learn a little bit more about you and how you got to where you are today. So maybe just for our listeners, just tell us, where did you grow up? Did you grow up Catholic? What was your sort of first experience of the faith that you recall?
Well, I grew up in Tipton, Iowa. It's a small town in the eastern part of the state. Did I grow up Catholic? Yes. I grew up in a Catholic home, though my mother was a convert and didn't actually enter the church until about the time of my confirmation. She was, her story of entering the church is maybe particularly interesting in a couple of respects. She her first exposure to Catholicism was in high school. She was at a boarding school, and girls were allowed to go into town to church on Sunday. And they all would gather together and try to make taxis full of people so that it would be less expensive. And she grew up as a Christian, but without any particular denominational affiliation. And so when one girl was Catholic and didn't have anybody to go, and with her, my mother said, "Sure, I'll go." And said she was particularly impressed by in general, the seriousness of the people who attended. That is, only coming to church, but kneeling and praying to get ready for the start of Mass and so on. So that particularly impressed her. She said it was the first time she'd ever been in a church where she felt like God himself was present in the church. So she had early, very good impression of the church, but only gradually entered. Maybe we forget how broad the Tiber is, how big the crossing is sometimes, but eventually she entered the church. And so, but all the time that I was growing up, it felt like a fully Catholic home. That is, the parents were Catholic. She came to Mass. They kept the days of abstinence and so on. So my own experience of it, I guess I want to say, in general, fairly normal. I can't think of anything extraordinary about it. I was in a small town. We did not have a Catholic school.
Okay.
We were probably just large enough to manage. Maybe the town was about 25% Catholic, but in fact there was no Catholic school there. So I went to public school all the way through, and I suppose that's a little bit of a different experience, but it was a good parish. We had religious education, catechism class, we call it, every Saturday morning, and in the summer some sisters came out from a nearby town from Iowa City and did a school of 1 or 2 weeks, sister school we called it. And, so that was, in general, the experience. This was in the 1950s and 60s, so it was at the point of the Vatican II reforms of the liturgy, and so I mean I experienced that. It was a gradual transition from the Tridentine Mass to the Vatican Mass, with I mean the different steps coming separately. That is, the switch to the vernacular came several years before the new liturgy and its new translation, even of prayers that were brought over from the Tridentine Mass.
And all that happened while you were in high school, or?
Yes, well, junior high and high school. Yeah, so I mean, I remember it in general, but not in great detail. And as you asked me, what year exactly did this or that happen? Because it was, as I said, the translation, the transition from Latin to English, and there was the expansion of the readings, and I think we began to sing hymns then and had not before. But it's hard for me to be sure about each of those, because I mean, first it's long ago, but second, it's just hard to remember each detail of the transition, which one came in which order. But
and so you grew up Catholic in this town, but you went to public school. Yes. How did you go from your education public school in Iowa to Georgetown University for your undergraduate education?
It was two things, I suppose one could say. Primarily, I was looking for a place where I could study Russian. Okay. And it was seemed to be a good place for that. But it's the only Catholic school I applied to, so I'm trying to think back and can't say that I was absolutely committed to Catholic higher education, but it was a factor, and so I decided to go there. And the language school is very good. So
that's just sort of interesting feature. Usually, I sit down with a Catholic philosopher or theologian, and usually it's philosophy, theology, all the way through their education. But you started out at Georgetown studying Russian language, yes, and culture. Just tell us a little bit where that interest came from and how far it carried you in your academic career.
I was always interested in languages, and my sophomore year in high school, I had an opportunity to go to a boarding school where they taught Russian, among other languages. Why did I pick it? There wasn't any special reason. It seemed different, seemed interesting, so I decided to do that. It was a very good course, so I got a good foundation. And when I came back to my own town for high school for the last 2 years of high school, I continued that for a year with a tutor at a local university. Okay. And then so in that way, built a good foundation. By the time I went to Georgetown, I was ready for second year of an accelerated intensive program. Right. So it was, I suppose because the foundation was so good, it appealed to me. Right. Of course, I read some Russian literature. I wasn't ready to read it in Russian at that point, but I read it in translation, and so that reinforced my interest in the language and the culture.
Yeah. So you studied there at Georgetown. You finished with a degree in Russian? Yes. And then where did you go from there? What was next for you?
I went to the University of Texas for graduate school. In linguistics. I had by that point I decided that I wanted to study linguistics. Texas has a good program in that. Their Slavics program was rather smaller, but my summer between junior and senior year, I did a summer abroad program in studying Serbo-Croatian in Yugoslavia. And that was because I was interested in comparative linguistics, and so studying another Slavic language was interesting. That was not available at Georgetown, but in this summer program, I could do it, and so I did. And one of the professors who was the American sponsor on that program was at Texas, and so I applied to go there.
So you finished, you had another degree in linguistics.
Yes.
When did philosophy sort of begin to enter into the picture there for you?
Well, I had to study philosophy, take 3 courses at Georgetown, and I did that. But I think my real interest in it emerged maybe as I was finishing undergraduate, my undergraduate degree, and I began reading a little bit of philosophy on my own, and more broadly, intellectual history, so history of science, theology, and so on. And my interest in that gradually grew. By the time I was finished with my master's in linguistics, I was beginning to think I really wanted to address different, in some ways bigger questions than I was addressing in linguistics. Maybe now as I think back of it, I can think of bigger questions that one could ask in linguistics than the ones that I was really asking, or the ones that I was really studying. But I decided I was interested in pursuing those. Didn't want to switch directly from one field to the other. I thought one could do that. One's lifelong, go from one field to the other. So I wanted to be sure that it's what I wanted to do. So I went on active duty in the Army. I had a commission from ROTC. I had required 3 months of active duty. I could have, this was 1975, so at that point the Army had more officers in its pipeline than it needed on active duty. So I could have just done 3 months and finished my military obligation in the reserves. But I thought maybe it'd be good to take some time off. So I applied to stay on active duty after my 3 months of training was accepted. Went to Germany for 3 more years of service.
Okay.
So while I was there, I continued to read philosophy, to some extent history of science, on my own. And I did a couple of courses at a community college and so on, just to supplement my exposure to philosophy. And then as I finished that, I decided that's what I was really interested, sort of wanted to study. I was also interested in kind of great books approach to education, and so when I left active duty, I went to St. John's College. They have a graduate program, and did that what they call Master in Liberal Education, and that also I thought gave me a little more formal preparation in philosophy for starting a graduate program.
Were there any particular influences on you at St. John's, or professors that you encountered in that great book style thing, or?
No, I mean they were good, but it's hard to think of real strong personal influence.
Yeah. And so after St. John's, you actually do some formal, some graduate formal study in philosophy. Next you go to Notre Dame.
Yes.
So tell us just a little bit about your experience there, and what specific area of philosophy that you were drawn to in your doctoral research. And
well, Notre Dame was a good program, so it turned out to be a good pick for me. The student body, that is the students of philosophy at the graduate level, maybe fell into 3 groups. Some of them were Catholics and very serious about Catholic issues and Thomistic philosophy. Some of them were Protestants who were very serious about philosophy, and also found, of course, something interesting in St. Thomas, but not exclusively so. I mean, it was a department that was at least as heavily analytic philosophy. So Alvin Plantinga was there, for example. So the second group was that group of Protestants interested in to some extent in philosophy of religion.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a third group that were interested in other philosophical topics. And so it was a varied department with respect to the students, but we all got along well together and studied well together, which was one of the good features of the program then, was that it was a very cooperative group of students who were eager to study together and help one another and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in general how things were there. I studied both philosophy and history and philosophy of science,
Okay.
but I ended up writing my dissertation in ethics.
Okay.
And so that's, I suppose, the description of
Sure.
Notre Dame as I experienced it.
We spoke on another occasion. You told me that one of your dissertation directors was David Solomon,
Yes.
whose name has come up here before, in particular with Professor Christopher Kaiser, another student of his, and then but also you had a class, I think, with Ralph McInerney, whose name also has come up here before. So it was a rich time with some great minds at that.
Yes, so the faculty was good too. I guess I spoke about the students, but it was a good faculty, so I learned from them. I'd also mention Ernan McMullen, who was very prominent, mostly in philosophy of science, but he also did some history of science as well.
Okay.
And so I learned a lot from him, also from the historians under whom I studied, Michael Crow and Phil Sloan.
Yeah. When you finished at Notre Dame, what was your first job at a university or?
No, I went to the Air Force Academy.
Okay.
I had been sort of 4 years in the Army. I had a commission. The Air Force at that time wanted their faculty to be active duty officers because they were educating students who were going to be on active duty. So that it'd be good to have for those students, the cadets, to have exposure to people who are, on active duty.
Sure.
Well, I wasn't an Air Force officer. I was an Army officer, and so on. But it still fit that general profile of what they were looking for. Their first recourse was to take active duty for Air Force officers who were interested, send them off to graduate school, and then bring them to the academy to teach for a tour, and then they go back to the Air Force, and then they come back. They might come back and teach. I guess they had a need, and didn't know quite how to fill that. And then one of their officers heard that I was writing a dissertation on just war theory and had a commission, so they wanted me to come out there and teach. The Army said, well, we have a military academy of our own. If you come on active duty, why don't you go teach there? And so I don't have anything against that, but they didn't invite me, they didn't ask me, so in the end, the Army didn't want to bring me on active duty to fill an Air Force need, so the Air Force offered me a direct commission.
Okay.
And in the Air Force, and I went on active duty and taught.
Okay.
So there for 4 years.
For 4 years, and then how did you get from there to where you ended your career at the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis? Yes. Were there many institutions, or did you go straight to St. Thomas?
No, I spent a year at Texas A&M University, so I think of it as my gradual transition to civilian life. I was not on active duty anymore, but of course, Texas A&M has, or at least had, a large corps of ROTC students, cadets, who came to class in uniform and so on. So I thought it was a gradual transition. But so, at the end of the 4 years, I could have stayed on active duty, but they would have expected me, as they expected any officer in that situation, to go off, take an Air Force assignment, and come back. And I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to continue teaching. So I just applied for jobs the ordinary way, got a job at Texas A&M, and went there for a year.
Okay.
And then from there I went on to St. Thomas.
So how many years was it for you at St. Thomas, your whole career there?
30 years
30
there.
years.
So, yeah, so my whole career, well, it's the whole end of the career and most of the career, but of course that's after the 5 years of Air Force and Texas A&M.
So you're there at the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis.
In St. Paul.
In St. Paul, excuse me. So how, give us a sense, I guess, of your work there. I know that there's both a minor and a major seminary.
Yes.
Are they on campus or on a different campus, but take classes?
They're both on campus.
Okay.
Sometimes when their dormitories spill over, they find another place for them to live, but they prefer not to do that because it's better to have the whole cohort of seminary students together. So, yeah, so some of my teaching was for them. They take classes. Most of their classes are just the same as anybody else for the minor seminary. That is, they get a degree from St. Thomas, so they have to fulfill all the requirements at St. Thomas. And so they're the same classes and mostly the same sections, but not all. Some of the philosophy courses that they take are limited to seminarians.
Sure.
So my ethics class, for example, was all seminarians. So
did you, every year you were at St. Thomas, you taught seminarians in that philosophy program?
Yes.
Most years?
I'm sorry?
Or most years?
Yeah, I'd have to go through year by year, but mostly I did. I taught this ethics course. It was just for seminarians. I taught other courses that had lots of seminarians in them just because they were such a large component of our philosophy students.
Yeah.
So,
any particular joys or difficulties of teaching seminarians philosophy?
No, it was a good seminary in lots of ways. It sometimes reminded me of what I think fraternities were supposed to be. That is, they worked together in a good sense, encouraged one another, and so on. And I think that that helped. Probably some of the seminary students were enthusiastic about philosophy, some maybe less so, and those that were less so, I think, were encouraged in a certain way to see others more enthusiastic and so on. So it was in general good experience. A pleasant experience teaching them. They were, as you might imagine, there are some that are stronger, some that are weaker, but all of them made an effort, and all of them took it seriously.
Good. Yeah.
So
from early on in your kind of academic life, you've been drawn to, as you said, kind of intellectual history, the history of science, the philosophy of science, and as your career matured, you've produced in the last several years 2 very significant books. One called The War That Never Was, and the other called The Origins of Catholic Evolutionism. So you've been drawn to this broadly, to this question of kind of science and religion, but more specifically to the issue of biological evolution and Catholic doctrine, you might say. Prescinding a little bit from maybe the details of any particular debates in there, where do you see what's the lay of the land of the kind of science and religion debate, or maybe the narrative of conflict between science and religion?
Well, it's it's an idea that the idea of there being such a conflict has been around for a while now, maybe 150 years or so. And it's an idea that does not have good scientific support. I think that as one thinks about it carefully, I was going to say as one thinks about it philosophically, but of course philosophers think carefully, but I don't want to say careful thinking necessarily involves philosophy. But as you look at the issue philosophically, as you look at it historically, one can see that there's not the kind of conflict that some people think there is. That idea of a conflict seems to have gotten deeply entrenched in the culture, but I think it's important to respond to it as both philosophically and historically. So
a lot of the work you do historically is to show that from the earliest days of, in particular, the Darwin's theory of evolution, that there was Catholic engagement of his thought, of the implications of his thought, of the scientific rigor of his thought. That it was never something that was sort of held at bay or ignored or rejected out of hand.
yeah, there was controversy from the start, but controversy means people that thought this could be incorporated in or was consistent with Catholic thought, or at least almost all of it. In the case of human beings, one has to be a little bit careful here, but there were many Catholics who thought it was not problematic, and there were Catholics who thought it was problematic, and so it's becomes a point of discussion for many years. Some contributors seemed to be noticed by historians more than others, and so I tried to, in the second book, tried to give a fairly comprehensive account of that.
Right. Maybe just give our listeners a little bit of an overview of how what you call Catholic evolutionism got to where it is today, to where the scholarly consensus is. How did we arrive there? What were the main points?
One thing that I notice about that is that the fundamental ideas develop early. Sometimes, of course, with a scientific or, I suppose, philosophical idea, you get an early version and then development over time. I mean, this is true of theory of evolution also. That is, you get the fundamental ideas in Darwin and Wallace, but there are some problems that have to be overcome and some adaptation of the theory. For example, in the 19th century, when Darwin was writing the theory of heredity that was generally accepted, didn't work real well with Darwinism, and that's the whole large theory had to be adapted to some extent in light of that as it came to recognize the soundness of Mendelian genetics, which was first proposed by Mendel in the 1860s, so about the time Darwin was writing, but was overlooked by everybody until about 1900, and then there had to be a reconciliation of the Darwinian thought with Mendelian genetics, which works out. So in a certain way, there's kind of a development. The fundamental ideas that Darwin held, they actually work better when you get Mendelian genetics than they did before. But lots of sciences, that's true, that you get a certain kind of development of the ideas over time. I think that's not particularly true of the synthesis of, if that's not too strong a word, of the recognition of the compatibility of evolution and Catholic theology. The fundamental idea especially focused on man, is the idea of evolution of the body, creation of a human soul that's infused into that. That emerges fairly early, and it seems to me that that's at the core of the contemporary Catholic evolutionism.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's not a development of the ideas as it is an increasing acceptance of the idea that there's not a theological problem here, unless you assert the completely evolutionary origin of human beings,
Right.
which is that's where the point of complication is,
Right.
and that proposed solution to that comes early.
It seems from reading your article and just from having the lay of the land here a little bit, it seems that there's, on the question of although there's some debate here, but it seems less so, that there's a great deal of comfort with a kind of broadly Darwinian account of the development of species in plants and animals and that kind of thing, and even of the human body. And in Catholic circles, at least, it seems like there are strong doctrinal reasons for what you call kind of like anthropological exceptionism, right? Exceptionalism, the idea that human beings really are different in kind than animals. It seems as though most of the interest in the inquiry is on this third part, which is the origin, the beginning of what you call the anthropogenic question, and there are broadly two camps here. Can you explain kind of what those ideas are?
Well, within Catholicism, there's, I suppose, a range of views that, on the one hand, there are people who there have been people who thought that the creation of the human body, better to say the formation of the human body, was some action by God on inorganic matter, or better to say unorganized matter. That is, inorganic matter. You say, how about a pile of dead leaves? Is that organic matter? Well, in one sense, it's organic matter, but the focus was on the idea that God formed what they call unorganized matter. That is, matter that doesn't have organs. The contrast was the idea that he took some animal body and reshaped it. So some insisted on inorganic or non-living matter as that which God shaped and into which he infused a human soul. The idea that God relied on evolutionary processes to form something from which he formed human beings by creating human soul. That view also has two forms. That is, one is the idea that God took an animal body and infused a human soul, and that's all it took to make it a human being. The other is that maybe the human body is not fully the product of evolutionary processes. Maybe God took some animal and modified it further to make it suitable. Receptacle's a kind of funny word. I don't think I want that, but to make it the kind of body which could be informed by a human soul. So one has these two different views present. The one that the body was directly and fully product of evolutionary processes, and the one that it was partially evolutionary, supplemented by divine modification.
And when it comes to that infusion of a spiritual soul into the first human beings, there is a question of what's sometimes called as monogenism and polygenism. How should people understand those two concepts?
Well, if one takes a ordinary Darwinian account of the origin of any species, one gets not just two individuals that are all of a sudden a new species, but an entire population that is the new species emergent from the old species. So that's a, you might call it polygenetic account, though that term sometimes is used exclusively to characterize human beings. But I mean, if we use it broadly, there's this kind of populationist account of the origin of species. And excuse me, the theological account of the origin of the human race is traditionally monogenistic. That is the idea that there's a single original couple, that for theological reasons connected to the doctrine of original sin. So there's a kind of a tension there between monogenism and Polygenism. Certain genetic factors, comparison of human beings and chimpanzees shows a kind of similarity that must be, not absolutely must be, but there's this very strong presumption that it's a product of descent from a common ancestor that showed that variation. And so the presumptive Polygenism that one finds in Darwin is reinforced by these genetic considerations. I argued in an article that I published now maybe 15 years ago that this tension can be resolved. Excuse me. That there is a way to accept both the Darwinian account of the evolutionary origin of the human body and that is the polygenistic aspect of that, and the monogenistic account required by theology. That requirement is suggested strongly by Pius XII in his Humani Generis, and it seems to me for perfectly good reasons. So I think the two can be reconciled.
So we won't get into a lot of the specifics of these issues, but that on that question is where a lot of the research remains. But I just want to close by asking you sort of, where do you think, is that argument, is that conversation at a kind of stalemate? Are we awaiting different kinds or new kinds of scientific evidence? Are we awaiting a sort of more rigorous application of philosophical principles? Is that argument moving forward, or is scholarly consensus growing on it, or is it, or if it isn't, where might new information to stimulate that come from?
Huh. Well, maybe I'm the wrong person to ask, because I think I solved it 15 years ago. Is it? Have I convinced everyone? Somehow not yet. I mean, some people found it singularly satisfying, really satisfying, and are happy with it as a solution. Some people reject evolutionary origin of the human race altogether, or evolution altogether. And there are people that who said, well, my solution looks maybe better than some others, but they're not convinced by it.
Sure.
So I don't know quite what to say. I'll say, yeah, it's solved. Go read an article that I wrote 15 years ago. But it's, I suppose, conversation ongoing. The people with reservations still have to be convinced, I'd say. What they're looking for, not new scientific ideas, I think, but maybe more philosophical thought about it or something. Some of them seem open to some kind of revision of the doctrine of monogenism in favor of, seems to be some kind of Polygenism. Some people accuse me of being a Polygenist because the details of what I suggest are basically a kind of biologically polygynist and theologically monogynist account. And so it's a conversation continues. Of course, I can say, no idea. I mean, what I just said, no idea is needed here. That's what I think. But I mean,
Kemp has taken care of it. I said Kemp has taken care of it.
Yes, yes. But of course, it's still being discussed. So you can look at concerns that other people have. For example, Father Mariusz Tabachek in his new book articulates these concerns about my views. I've got an answer I think is going to come out in Lux Veritatis one of these days.
Okay.
But, well, my answer to him and his comments on that. So it's, I suppose in that way, the fairer and more objective answer would be discussion continues.
Continues. Very good. Well, thank you so much for your visit to Cape Girardeau, for your time today. It's been a pleasure to meet you and to discuss these matters with you.
Well, again, thanks for the invitation. I'm always glad to discuss these things.
Very good. Thank you.